How is the ego formed? And what are the consequences that follow the creation of this mental structure and way of operating? My name is Pablo. This is Meditation Amsterdam. Today we get to do video number 2 in the book series of The Pearl Beyond Price by A.H. Almaas. In the first video I gave an introduction about the book, about its importance, and emphasized how Almaas does a great job at making a link between object relations theory, developmental psychology, and spiritual enlightenment. And also how important it is to understand the way the ego comes about and the ramifications of this in order to later on do the spiritual work of dismantling the ego in an effective way. Almaas makes a very interesting statement, which is that in psychology, the formation of the ego is considered a great achievement in the early developmental stages of a human being. And today I want to talk about what is the very concrete step that takes place for the initial ego formation, and one huge consequence that this brings, which is often, if not altogether, ignored in psychology. So, if you remember, we said that the creation or formation rather of the ego was a developmental achievement in the eyes of psychology. It's a big step for the individual to go from being a mind at large, so undifferentiated soup of perceptions, let's call it like that, bodily perceptions, images, everything is being perceived all at once, all-encompassing, non-differentiated, and there's no sense of self. So that before the psychological birth of the individual takes place, there is a state there, before there is a me or an ego. But then through interaction with the primary object of affection, which is the mother, something happens. Two objects are created in the mind. Remember, we're talking about object relations theory here. So there is a self-object that's created, and the object of a mother is created. So now what was once an undifferentiated whole of perception has split itself into subject and object. But what's interesting is that both subject, the sense of self, and object, the mother, are both mental objects. So that the actual self that was behind it all has now projected two objects out there. It has identified itself with one of them, and it has projected the other to the outside. This is absolutely crucial to understand because of the work that's to come later on. So this split takes place, and Almaas says the sense of being an individual is nothing but taking oneself to be this self-image. In other words, we identify ourselves, our sense of self, with the object of the sense of self. In other words, the individual is a mental structure, a construct of the mind. This is absolutely crucial. This is the point at which egoic identification takes place. And at the same time, in order for us to be stable and feel protected, we create this object of the mother to which we can relate even when the physical mother is not there, right? So there we go. And from here on out, we have an ego, and we are completely identified with it. We are identified with the image of ourselves as opposed to our actual selves. And from here on out, psychology tries to make us be as happy and autonomous as we can be by improving that image and working on it, perfecting it. And it can be improved upon, for sure. But something fundamental is lost. And what is lost is our actual self, our actual beingness. it's been hijacked by the self-image that was created in this split. And the consequences are, of course, manifold. One of them is that there is a baseline of suffering and certain absence and unfulfillment that no amount of psychological development and work can resolve. Because the psychological work being done is being done on the self-image and the egoic level of the mind, as opposed to that which was there before the ego and the self-image were created. And it has another consequence, and of course, what I just mentioned about that base level suffering is the domain of spirituality. And secondly, there is a certain sense in which we feel that we don't have autonomy, sort of bare bones autonomy, so that we created an ego or developed one. That ego might be actually a very healthy ego. It's an ego that can go out in the world, create relationships, make a living for itself, be a productive member of society, and do a lot of really good stuff. So on the level of ego, there's fully developed autonomy on the intellectual level, on the emotional level, and so on. And yet, a person who has developed all of that can still feel fundamentally unfulfilled. It may be very prevalent, maybe it's very tangible, and maybe it's way, way back in the psyche, but it is nevertheless there. And the reason for this is that fundamental autonomy can only be had on the level of being, not on the level of doing, thinking, and emoting. And that level of being is there, or was there, before we developed a self-image and identified with it in an egoic way, and can only be had if we return to having contact with and re-identifying with that which was there before we were an ego, before we developed a psychological sense of self. So that the autonomy of the ego is very handy, can do a lot in making us emotionally fulfilled, effective in the world, and yet is on some fundamental level kind of spurious, and in fact is a kind of prison, because it is the autonomy of the image of ourselves as opposed to the autonomy of our actual selves. And this is a fundamental distinction, and is one which seems to escape psychology altogether, so that we can chase our tail trying to be more effective, better in our emotional maturity and how we relate to others, and maybe even fully autonomous on all those levels, and yet be not really autonomous in the core of ourselves, because all the autonomy of the ego is the autonomy of a self-image as opposed to the actual self. So this is the essential gist of this video. We're going into a lot of detail now about these topics, but it really sets the stage to what's there to come later, because understanding this allows us to understand why psychology falls short of being a spiritual science, and where these two meet is in understanding how ego develops and what are the consequences and what is lost through that achievement. Ego development is a big psychological achievement, creates separation and individuation, so we can be egoically autonomous, but something is lost. There's a price to be paid for that, which if not regained later down the line, makes us live a life that is not entirely authentic and autonomous in the way we'd like to think. So that was video number 2 on the Pearl Beyond Price. Very curious about your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comment section. And as usual, if you think that this is content that would benefit others, then your liking, sharing, and subscribing props up the channel. Very motivating to me as well. I'll be back with more videos pretty soon, and until then, cheerio, bye-bye.